move on to Eliot's presentation on the museum. Okay, a little bit about Eliot James. He completed his Bachelor of Science in IE&T from Western Illinois University in 1986. Together with partners Bill and Bob Meinhardt, Eliot purchased the ex-USS Hercules sight unseen for the Navy surplus in 1996. The balance of 5 other PHMs were sold to Charleston shipbuilders for scrapping and repurposing. They negotiated a deal. This is Eliot and his partners negotiated a deal with Charleston shipbuilders to trade ex-USS Hercules for ex-USS Aries, which was the most complete of all the PHMs and the only one to retain her foil system. Included in that deal was the ability to refit Aries in the recently closed Charleston Naval Shipyard, where the boat was operating, which was operating at the time alongside the balance of PHMs, and they were able to preserve many PHM specialized parts that would otherwise have been lost and would serve as spares that would never have been able to be economically replicated. And at the time I was working for Naval Ship Engineering Center in Crystal City, and that's when I first met Eliot. He was in the throes of trying to figure this all out before the PHMs were consigned to the scrapyard, and he learned that there was a full set of operation and maintenance manuals down at the Inactive Ships facility in Norfolk. So I was able to talk to a couple of people in headquarters and arrange for the transfer of the tech manuals to Eliot James. So it's really good to know that they were put to good use. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eliot.
Thanks for that introduction, Mark. It's and thank everybody for having me here. I'm kind of in very special company. Everybody here knows the ships before they were built, while they were being designed, and when they were built and deployed. And I'm very jealous of everybody for that. I came into the hydrofoil scene pretty much as Mark said. We bought an aluminum ship out in Norfolk, Virginia. My partner had come to me with this before and said, hey, these are out there. And I knew what a hydrofoil was, but I didn't have very much information about it. And when we purchased the Hercules, and then John Meyer called me up and said, and I didn't know John or the International Hydrofoil Society, and he introduced me, and he said, do you know what you bought? And of course I didn't really. They were kind of slipped through the cracks, as it were. And I have a feeling that John and maybe Mark and some of the others that were still serving with the Navy kind of helped that happen, because they are technically a warship, and warships aren't supposed to be sold to civilians. And how they got saved, I'm not exactly that we were able to be part of that. So at that time I flew out to Norfolk, Virginia to see what it is that we bought, and that's when I discovered that how awesome these ships were. I hadn't seen anything other than a couple of small videos from very close, so I couldn't say anything about them. And so I got very excited about it, and then my partners and me spent the next 4 months in Charleston, South Carolina, putting them back together, buying surplus material that was still coming up for sale through the DRMOs, and with help from Mark and John and Sumi and a lot of the guys from the International Hydrofoil Society, we were kind of able to put together a picture of what these ships looked like and how they operated. We were blessed that we were all mechanical people, even though none of us had any experience in the ocean specifically, or with big ships in general. By the time we got ready to sail, which we weren't ever really ready to sail, but we were just out of money and it was time to go. Our initial plan had been, let's go out and we'll get it all ready, and then we'll find and we'll hire a crew. And by the time it came to it, we didn't have any money for a crew. And so we decided to try it out and try rolling the ship in around there in Charleston and Harbor. And it turns out it really wasn't so bad. So I think I remember calling Mark and saying, well, you know, we're just going to head south. And if we run into trouble, then we'll hire a crew. And one piece of advice Mark told us, he says, if you have to go out, you have to be able to put the foils down. That is critical. It doesn't matter if you can't get them back up, but you make sure that you can put the foils in the water. And said, okay, well, that's what we did. We made sure that we had enough hydraulics and we knew the systems, and we had the systems operating to the point that if we had to go out, which there was a couple of places we had to, into the water, into the ocean, that if we got into trouble, we could drop the foils. And we asked him, so what do we do if it gets storms? And then you says, you just get away from land as far as you can go. With the foils down, you'll be okay. And fortunately, we did try, there were we left it at August, which of course is, hurricane season just lining up. And we did sweat it a little bit, but we decided to head south. And so all we did was we stayed in the intercoastal waterway where we could. We sailed, the three of us. We did have some help from a man named Don Plesla. He was an electrician and he was an old salt. And he helped us a lot, especially when I couldn't be there. He helped round out the three guys, and 3 guys was really pretty much the minimum that you could have and be able to go someplace. So we left Charleston and headed south on the intercoastal, and we really, it was a really good trip. We really didn't have any significant problems. We had a couple. We lost a boat that got flooded and flipped upside down, our launch. And there was a time when the generator went out, and when that happened, we had no backup at the time. And since the ship is fly-by-wire, ran off an industrial computer, and all the hydraulics went dead. And so that's a little sketchy, because you're sitting down in down below where I was at the time, when the generator goes out, and then it's just nothing but panic, right? Figure out first thing you get up there, somebody grab an anchor. And everybody else try to find out how to get this thing, the generator, lit again. But there weren't very many problems like that. So we sailed about 100 miles a day, and we went down. We were just a little too wide to go through Okeechobee, which we didn't really want to anyway, because we really wanted to sail back through the Keys. And there's a bridge in the Okeechobee that's 47 feet wide, and 47 foot is the width of the Aries half foil. So we decided it was the most prudent thing to sail on down through the Keys, and so that's what we did. And we went down and we crossed over at Marathon. Now the ship had been decommissioned. This was 97 by this time, and so the ships had left Key West a few years before, but there were a lot of people down. When you get close to the Keys, lots of people knew who the ship was. And everybody says, are you coming back? Are you coming back? And of course, the ship being only recently decommissioned, she was still in very good shape, and she looked like a Navy ship. And we found it to be to our advantage not to dissuade that idea. Even though there were no Navy personnel on board, we found that if everybody thought we were a Navy ship, we got along better with everybody. And so we had no trouble. Of course, we had no licenses, no documentation. We didn't have anything. And subsequently, we were always worried that we would run into issue, but we never did. Once in down near Marathon, we did get boarded, and we got boarded by the Coast Guard, who came up, and they actually asked permission to come aboard, which was unusual because usually the Coast Guard doesn't ask permission. And we let them on board, and all they wanted was a tour. So we were obliged with that. And fortunately, all we really had to do was meet recreational boating requirements because we were a recreational vessel, even though we had no paperwork to support that idea. There was nothing to say that we weren't, I suppose. And it might be a little bit more difficult today, but at the time, it worked for us. We traveled mostly on the idea that it's better to ask permission or ask forgiveness than it is permission. And that served us pretty well. So the only other time that we had any issues with any law enforcement was in Miami, and there was a bridge that was shut down and it closed early for maintenance. And we were downtown in Miami, just off of South Beach, and a police officer from the sheriff's department comes screaming out in this big Scarab. And of course, we're sitting there. We've already dropped our anchor, and we've got the generator on the deck screaming away. And he says, "What do you think you're doing?" And says, "Well, we're stopped for the night." He says, "You can't stay here." He said, and we said, "Well, the bridge is closed." He says, "But it doesn't matter. You can't stay here. You know who lives right there?" And we said, "Nope." He says, "Well, that's Donald Trump. And I'm going to catch a whole rash of crap if you guys sit here making all this racket." And we said, "Well, you know, if you get that bridge open, we'll be on our way." Well, he couldn't get the bridge open, and evidently Donald was not in town, or at least he didn't see fit to file a complaint. So we were able to stay the night, and then we traveled on. We passed through Marathon, then we came up the west coast of Florida, where it was the only place that we were out of sight of land. And it was surreal because the channel there is so far out because the water is so shallow that it was one of my favorite parts of the journey. So we came up through there, and then through Pensacola, and then to and went north to the Tenn-Tom Waterway, to the Tennessee River, to the Ohio River, to the Mississippi River, to the Missouri River, and then we finally parked on the Grand. So it was about 2,500 miles, and it took us about 45 days. We steamed at about 12 knots. We burned about 55 gallons an hour when we were steaming, and that was mostly due because we pulled the SSPU off and plugged in a diesel recip, which was a whole lot more efficient. The problem, as these guys all know, with a turbine is it burns about 70% of the fuel just to idle. So when you have the capacity of the SSPUs did of running all the hydraulics, each SSPU could run all the hydraulics, which was 225 horsepower pumps, plus a starter for the main turbine, plus the electrical 250 kilowatt electrical supply. Well, that's an awful lot. And you're only using that a little bit at a time. So we were able to replace it with a 60 kW diesel genset. That's all we had to have. So that's how we were able to steam significantly less expensively. One of the other great things about the ship was she was built for the computer age. She was all fly-by-wire, like I said. All the controls were. Now, most of the computer controls were gone. But what we did was we put together industrial controls, a programmable logic controller, and we used that to control the steering. We used an original the other ships, and we used original helm, and we used the original steering cylinders and the valve and the thrust reversers, and we used all of the original gear there, all the hard stuff that it is to acquire. But then we plugged in an industrial PLC, and so that's how we were able to control the ship and the engines, and it worked very well. It was quite a rigged up affair. And it's embarrassing if we have a real sailor come and take a look at it, because let alone a naval architect, because what we put together was pretty primitive, but it worked, and it worked really well. Like I said, we never really had any, other than losing power once or maybe twice, we never really had any any big problem. So it got us home, and that was the main thing. The 60 cycle power, that's the 400 cycle power, that is a challenge. So the ship has on it today, it has 60 cycle 480 volt, it has 60 cycle 110 volt, it has 400 cycle 480, and 400 cycle 110 for all the lights. So there's a lot of power, and you learn a lot about three-phase 400 cycle power. Which of course we'd never seen before, but it's not too difficult. So we got the ship home, and then when she's home, it was kind of, let's figure out what we're going to do with this thing, and that's when my wife, her idea was let's start a museum, and that's where the USS Aries Hydrofoil Museums came from, and how we got established. And so she did some work. She did a lot of work in getting our 501c3 tax exempt status, which gives us the ability to acquire spares and parts from the Navy through the ship donation program. And it also lets us get equipment and stuff from the federal surplus. And that's been a big help to us. It's really helped our ability to acquire equipment and parts and things that we need to not just for the Aries, but for the shipyard in general. We started collecting other hydrofoils at this time, including President Nixon's Volga, which was a present from Soviet Premier Brezhnev in 1972. And then we acquired some other Boeing stuff. We have the Fresh One, Foil Research Ship One, which we got from Dave Symington out in Seattle. Sumi helped us with that significantly. And we also have the Little Squirt now, and we have several personal watercraft, some small civilian craft. So we've got a pretty good fleet of hydrofoils, and our goal one day is to put this all together into a National Hydrofoil Society. We're really good at collecting stuff, and we're really good at making stuff run. Our weak points are the administration and the logistics of creating a museum. But at least what we've been able to do, if not, is save these things. And that's been a big part of what we're about. Accumulate and preserve and then restore as we can. We do have the technical capability of restoring to flight all of our hydrofoils. I have no doubt in their ability, especially with a lot of the help that we've been able to get from the Hydrofoil International Hydrofoil Society. A lot of the talent there it still exists, and hydrofoils are especially some of the size of the Aries and the Fresh One and the Little Squirt. These require control systems, and these control systems are far more readily available today than they ever were, and we can do them with much smaller and much less expensive equipment. And so I think that eventually we want to see more of our hydrofoils fly, including the Aries. Our goal is to be able to take the Aries and travel, and not just the Aries, but other hydrofoils with us, and be able to go, because we've noticed that in maritime museums, they start out like gangbusters, and they're great. And it doesn't matter where it is. It could be the Intrepid Air Space Museum out in New York. They still have a very difficult time keeping it fresh enough to keep people. And they've got a lot of neat stuff. They've got an SR-71, and they've got, they've got some, and a Concorde now. But the problem is it is keeping a museum fresh enough to get interest in. Now, New York has a lot of visitors. Missouri doesn't have a lot of visitors. Now, we're not South Dakota or North Dakota, but still we don't have a whole lot of visitors. But the ability to take our vessel and become a visiting exhibit then that's our main goal, because what that does is it gives freshness to a museum that otherwise that's revolved around one specific ship, and it gives a freshness to it, and it brings those local people back, and it also brings back people who may be interested in seeing our ship. So that's our goal. We have now a base in Gasconade Harbor. We purchased the old naval shipyard there, the Gasconade Government Shipyard, and that shipyard's been there since about 1898. During World War II, a number of landing craft and other Navy vessels were built there, and it was unofficially part of what they call the Catfish Navy. A lot of ships and craft were built on the river system because it was protected from the Germans on in the East Coast and the Japanese on the West Coast, and so it was a relatively safe place. So it saw a lot of use, and it fell into disrepair after the last tenants had occupied it, and they were actually a company called J.T. Cullen, and they built the nuclear power plant in Callaway, which is not very far away from us. And after that, it sat for a very long time, and we were able to acquire it shortly after for taxes. And so it gives us a place to accumulate. The Aries is there now, and a lot of our other exhibits are there, and it gives us a place to come, and it's cheap to stay there. It's cheap to keep, and it gives us kind of a good base of operations. Like I said, our idea is that when the weather starts turning, we start thinking about loading up and headed south, and start visiting some of these other places on down the river systems, and then on out back down to Key West. We've been invited to Key West, and we'd love to go back there. So that's our goal. That's about it.
Thanks, Eliot. Appreciate that. At this point, what I'd like to do is open it up for any questions for Richard or Carl or Eliot, anything they've talked about, or any questions that come to mind, any aspect. One question I have right off the bat, Eliot, is have you looked into how you acquired LM2500, surplus, so to speak?
Yeah, we actually have. There are a couple of different ways. One is there are the PHMs use what's called a twin shank engine, which was an earlier version of the LM2500. And some of the FFGs that have been lately decommissioned, many of those use that same engine. So the Navy hasn't surplused those out. They ordered a bunch of storage containers, and as far as I know, they're storing them. But new ships, while the LM2500 is still a very viable and used power plant, the newer ships use the new single shank engines, and subsequently there's quite a bit of surplus there. And it's our intention to acquire one of these, whether it's by on a straight up surplus sale or through the ship donation program. Directly with the U.S. Navy. That was one of the parts about us becoming a museum, is it let us qualify for that. So then there's a couple of other avenues we've looked at, including power generation, because there are several LM2500s used in gas turbine generators. That's a possibility. But we, at this point, acquiring an LM2500 is easier than putting it in the ship and making use of it. And so that's one thing that we haven't pushed really hard to get one yet. One, we know that they're becoming easier to acquire and subsequently less expensive. And two is that we need to have a good plan of reinstalling one. Fortunately, all of the specialized equipment that was made for the PHMs to adapt a LM2500 from any other ship all of that stuff's there. And we have extra gearboxes. We have extra four-borne propulsors. We have most of the equipment that would be required to install it. Most of the specialized stuff, because the PHM to install, but most of that stuff we have plenty of spares for.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that next, because I remember that, you know, there was a special suspension system for mounting the turbine and the acoustic enclosure, you know, with all the noise attenuation had to take place. It was pretty impressive at its time. It was a total custom installation. So is the actual enclosure for the foil-borne turbine still in the boat, or was that taken out?
No, the enclosure is still all there. And initially, the way the ship's constructed, to install the turbine, it was actually broke in two pieces and then dropped down through the top. To remove it, however, they didn't want to break the turbine in half. So what they did was they took sawzalls to the to machinery room 3, which is on the main deck, and they cut a notch out of it so that the engine can come out through that in one piece. Now, what we did was we have those pieces bolted back in, but instead of welding and retaining the integral structure of and repairing the integral structure of the bulkheads, we left it cut because it would probably be much easier for us to keep the LM2500 intact and set it back down the same way the original ones come out. And then we would go in and repair that hull or the bulkheads.
Eliot, this is Joel. I have a question. Other than the LM2500, what would it take to get the Aries foil-borne again?
As far as equipment, we have all the hydraulic actuators, all the hydraulics, the foils. The LM2500 is the only part missing. We do have the gearboxes and the propulsor, all that's still involved, even the ducts and the flexible ducts that get bolted in. We need an automatic control system. That's probably the thing other than the LM2500, that's the only thing we're missing, which actually is probably the easiest to replace at this point. We still do have some sonic height sensors installed. The radar height sensors were removed, but we have all the plumbing for them. I'm sure that we'd probably use something completely different now. But as far as equipment-wise, the LM2500 and an ACS, that's our. We did put together a loose budget, if it were. We were approached by a producer for Miramax a few years ago, and they had this great story for a movie, and they were still in the planning stage for it, and they shared that plot with us, and it would have made a really, really good movie. But they wanted to know, they wanted a rough order of magnitude of what it would take to have a PHM flying. And we put together a budget. And at that time, we thought about that we would probably have to purchase an LM2500 on the used market. And with what we knew we were out there then, including the purchase of the LM2500 and the contracting of an ACS, and the other things, that we had a budget of just under $3 million, which in and of itself is not much money for making a PHM fly. And about 1.2 of that was the actual purchase of an LM2500.
Eliot? Hello, Eliot. This is Martin Mandels.
Hi, Martin.
Hi. Eliot, what are the chances, if any, of ever getting the Fresh One flying again?
The Fresh One, when Dave Symington, who acquired it in Seattle, when he did so back in the early 70s or late 60s, it would have flown. It was complete. Now, since then, it sat in his yard in up in the island, was it Bremerton? And it sat there, and it was pilfered extensively. Now, as far as what it would actually take, the turbine engine is free, and it is complete, and it's got all the special items that were manufactured specifically for that, particularly the ducts, because it's a turbo fan. And so it has a large duct that was fabricated to take the bypass air and bring it in and combine it in two small tubes with the main jet exhaust, and that comes out the back. And all that is still there. Now, those with the TF-33s, I'm sorry, I don't quite remember which turbine that is, but they're very, there's a lot of those around as well. But as far as spare parts, we have the main ones there. The cabin, of course, would have to be redone, and it would need an ACS as well. We do have both sets of foils, and that is the sub-cavitating foils, and we have the what they call the transition foils. And we have those, and we have all the actuators. Again, mostly there we're talking about a rebuild of the turbine engine that's there and an ACS system. So probably total project cost, if we subbed out the rebuild of the turbine engine, and we could get that done for less than $300,000, which I think is possible. And that's, again, if we just sub that out, not if we work with a school that does restorations. There's a couple here in Missouri that does rebuild. That's not counting on that. We think that the fresh one could fly for less than $700,000.
Okay, and Carl, I have a couple of questions very quick. First, I want to thank you for mentioning Vern Salisbury. He was my idol. Retired colonel in the Marine Corps, combat pilot in World War II, taught me everything I know about aerobatic flight when we had his A1 at Sandpoint Naval Air Station in Seattle. And of course, he taught me everything I knew about the Tucumcari. And we did hit a deadhead. He did it. I didn't. I'm the one who hit the pier at Treasure Island, Naval Air Station Treasure Island in San Francisco Harbor when we came in en route from Seattle to Coronado, and the solenoid that dropped the thrust reverser over the little water jet in the stern of the ship failed. And I kept telling him to add a little more power, hoping I could get it to stop heading toward the pier. And all I did was keep going faster and hit the pier at maximum hull-borne speed, which in those days was 6 knots. And so Vernon took out the front foil once in Eliot Bay, and I took out the front foil once in San Francisco Bay. But we had a long and great relationship. And I'm glad that you remember him as fondly as I do. Secondly,
yes, he was a very, he taught me a lot, not only about how to operate the ship, but a lot of the ways of operating at fast speed and keeping your mindset there. Because I was a slow surface guy that, did 2 tours on DDGs at about 15 knots and a tour on an LST, which was a large, slow target before I got to Aries. So thinking at 40 knots was a lot different than thinking at 10 knots.
No question. And both he and I were pilots, so we already had that going for us. But again, there's a difference when you come back or move from airplanes to hydrofoils, and so you had to be alert at all times. So my last question: you mentioned I forget the exact terminology you used about what happened to the Boeing people who were in the hydrofoil program. As I recall, you said something about it was the kiss of death. Was that where those?
Well, not so much the Boeing people. I was referring mainly to the Navy folks.
Well, let's consider both of those just briefly. Did any of the Navy people associated with the I guess we'd say from Fresh 1 through PHM. Did any of them advance to Admiral, if you know? And did any of the Boeing executives in their hydrofoil program, including the jetfoil, ever advance to executive management at Boeing?
That I can't answer, but I do know that obviously Vern and Dick Dugan, some of those folks, I can't speak for the engineers, but the folks that I did face to face with, they were a little bit older, so I suspect they were, I'm not sure what happened with Boeing Marine Systems. I didn't follow that, what happened with that part of the company. As far as I said, I know of 3 or 4 folks that were associated with the PHM program that made flag officer. So they were junior officers when they were on the PHM, so it was kind of a nice tour for them. I know my contemporaries, none of us, made flag, which sometimes that's a blessing, not to start over as a junior flag officer. But but I can't speak for the Boeing folks, because I say once I went to Key West, you may have known Tony. Tony was down there for part of the contractor logistics support. I know that Tony retired. And I think there was one other, Glenn. There's a couple other guys that I recall. I can't remember their last names, but most of them, I think, were probably pretty much middle to older age. Mark may know more about Boeing Marine Systems folks than I do.
Well, the last one, just to go finish this, Frank Horn. By the way, when I left the Navy, it was at the completion of turning her over, a change of command to Richard Stead. And so I never had anything more to do with hydrofoils at Boeing or in the Navy after that. So I was never on a PHM. I never saw a PHM. I never wrote a PHM. I'm really old. In fact, my Social Security check just came today. With an extra bonus for being so old. I turned 80 last weekend. But Frank Horn, I remember meeting him in Key West at a hydrofoil reunion, and I thought he was the Commodore or the commander of the squadron in Key West. Whatever became of him? He was very active. He was the treasurer of the Hydrofoil Society. One day I heard he'd paid off his mortgage, and the other day I heard he'd quit the International Hydrofoil Society as treasurer. And I thought maybe that wasn't a coincidence.
Yeah, Martin, I can talk to that. Frank's alive and well, living with his son and daughter-in-law, or daughter and son-in-law in Northern Virginia. He was treasurer for a number of years, but we transferred that responsibility to Roger Schaefer. But I talked to Frank probably 2-3 weeks ago to see how he's doing, and he's fine. He's had a lot of heart issues over the years, but keeps bouncing back. So
was he the Commodore in Key West?
Yeah, he was. He was.
Yes. He was the second Commodore. He was the second Commodore at Key West. He basically, the first Commodore was a commander, Mike Hart. He was just kind of the transition. But once all 6 ships were there, Frank. I also worked with Frank when he was back in the bureau before the Commodore, before the Key West. But yes, he was the Commodore during my entire tour. I think he was relieved about the same time I was relieved in October of '84. I think Frank moved on. I guess he got a tender. I think he got one of the big tender jobs. I'm not sure, Yellowstone or one of the big ADs. And then I'm not sure what happened to him. I did see him at that same 2013 gathering in Key West. And I did know he was having some issues. I know that Steve Scudder was his chief staff officer, and Steve was kind of watching after him. So, but thanks for bringing up his name, and thanks, Mark, for the update, because like I said, I keep looking. Unfortunately, sometimes obituaries, I see those on folks that I would rather not see on, but I haven't been able to track down Frank, but I appreciate that info.
Yeah, could usually.
Hey, did any of you guys ever hear of Frank? I think his name was Peter Squicciarini. Does that ring a bell to you?
Oh, yeah.
Right, Pete was the XO. I think I want to say it was on, I want to say Taurus, but I'm not sure. But yeah, Pete was there when I was there.
Right.
He was on Pegasus.
Was it Peggy?
Before I sign off, I want to thank you, Carl and Eliot and Richard. I thought all the presentations today were absolutely fantastic. Brought back a lot of great memories. And whenever I think of any of you, or I think of the Navy or hydrofoils, I smile, and I shall continue to do so. And thank you again.
I appreciate that, Martin.
Thanks, Martin. Any other comments, Martin Grimm or Joel?
Yes, I have a question for Carl. I've heard a statistic, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but that the PHMs, in being assigned to their counter-drug activity, accounted for more drug bust, if you will, than the Coast Guard, as part of the Coast Guard, but they accounted.
Certainly, I know there's some. I just saw. I was doing all sorts of Google, and I saw George Jenkins's presentation. I think there's another one Les Jackson has out there that has some stats. I don't recall the stats.
Yeah.
I don't know with cocaine, if it's. But again, marijuana was the primary drug at that stage back in the early 80s that was being transported either by airdrops. What we heard was that there was supposed to be a ship out there to meet this airdrop, and they got scared away, and that's why we ended up picking up 40 or 50 bales of marijuana that day. But I think Mark has those numbers at the tip of his tongue. But you're right. I mean, we were really down there, and of course now there's a big footprint down there. When I was there for 2013, I saw the Coast Guard footprint, and they certainly have taken over Trumbo Point and have established a major point there. So, Mark.
Yeah, Joel, I have a slide on that. My presentation on PHM. I have it in the background right now, or I'll be including that in the presentation next week.
Mark, I've got a comment and a question, please.
Yeah.
Eliot, I'd like to say that it was really exciting to hear your adventures on the river. Patricia and I did the Grand Loop between 2000 and 2005. We did it in a little different ship, though. We had a 28-foot Bayliner with a single engine. But it's pretty exciting, big barges and everything, and all these problems with negotiating ports and trying to tie up when the river's flooded and things like that. It's very interesting. And Carl, I had a couple of questions for you. Unmute, please.
Sure.
I'm interested about your Gulf crossings. How much of that time was foil-borne? And what did you do for refueling? Could you do that at sea, or did you?
We used the Stark, as I said, when we came down from Bremerton and went down through the canal. We used the Stark, I think, at least once between Bremerton and San Diego, and then between San Diego and Panama, we probably used her once or maybe twice. It's been a long time ago. In Panama, we were able to refuel. They arranged. It was JP5, is what the ship was burning. So as long as there was an some sort of aviation facility nearby. When we went to New Orleans, we stopped at Pensacola, and even New Orleans, there was at that time a major naval support activity on one side of the river, so we refueled there. So it was pretty easy, again, because it was JP5, as long as there was an aviation facility nearby. I think at Nassau, we did the same thing, certainly Port Everglades, Jacksonville. We used Gitmo, we used a big yellow tanker truck would pull up and stick out their hose and fill us up.
What was your range?
Well, it was 400 miles if we were foil-borne, not foil-borne. I don't know. We went from San Francisco. Well, we went from, I have a telegram or a flashing light that I got from the CEO of the Stark. He said, hey, if I don't want to I told him I didn't need to refuel as we were going past Cuba. So I think we made it all the way from Panama to Key West without refueling from the Stark. But I'd have to say, I mean, again, we use sprint and drift. Normally we figure about 12 knots for our average when we were figuring out, how far we were going to go in a day. And so that's an interesting question. I haven't really figured out the range. Like I said, we went to Gitmo. We flew to Guantanamo Bay in 10 hours, but we were pretty much foil-borne as soon as we always had to go foil-borne away from the water, away from the land. We couldn't fly into the land. But as soon as we caught the buoy off of Key West, we were foil-borne, and we landed 10 hours later in Gitmo. But of course, we were, only had probably roughly about 4,000 gallons left. So,
yeah, good. Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. I have to never really looked at it that way. I was always thinking in my head more about the average speed that we were going to do over ground and how much fuel we were going to have.
Think about how far you can go or how long you can go.
Yeah, with the sprint and drift, you could figure it, it'd be a good math problem. I'll have to ask my eighth grader grandson if we figure that one out, because we always do the if train A left at, 10 minutes after train B, that new math stuff.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, Carl, just to follow up on that, that you quote 400 miles foil borne. I know that, and I've got a slide on this stuff too. The quoted range foil borne, I guess at 40 knots was a number quite a lot more than that. It was something like 700 nautical miles. So when you say 400, was that, did that go along with leaving a certain amount of?
Well, it'd be 16. I mean, if you wanted to suck it down to zero, which nobody ever was that comfortable,
right.
It'd be basically 16. Again, I just use 1,000 as a round figure, so I'm up on the bridge trying to figure it out.
Right.
But that'd be 16 hours times 40 would be 640 miles.
Okay.
But
you never took it down that low.
No,
Right.
And again, a lot of it depended, of course, on what you were carrying. When we went from Bremerton to Key West, I don't think we had harpoons on. But I mean, when you see some of these ships going 50 plus, which everybody says they did 55, 60, that would be sea state zero with no fuel, very little fuel, and certainly probably no.
Yeah, in fact, talking about speeds that high, I remember an anecdotal story about, I guess it was Tucumcari flying in really calm, very calm water, sea state zero with reduced foil submergence. And I mean, the number I heard was like 58 knots. And, but it sounded like it was a pretty hairy situation with, like maybe one chord submergence on the foil. So, and I don't think they flew that.
Yeah, I mean, that was the other issue too, is, you always had a little, I mean, I'm sure that those that know Vern Salisbury, where I learned from, is, there was a little bit of people got a little itchy. Normally you'd like to have at least 1 meter of foil in the water. And if you started creeping up a little bit, which you could, but people started getting a little bit nervous that,
Right.
I think they said if you brought that forward foil out of the water, they weren't sure what would happen.
Right.
So, you always had to, and again, even in sea state zero, you could probably get to about 1 meter. You used everything was in meter. You get about 1 meter out, and that obviously again, you're going to have your max speed. You're going to have higher speed than if you're sitting down there at two meters in the water or something.
Richard Stead, did you ever go 58 knots in Tucumcari?
Absolutely, and more.
Okay. By the way, Carl, Vern Salisbury was, I was the first co-pilot of Fresh, but Boeing was kind enough to get me back into Stanford for my senior year in May of '64. And it was 2 months later that Vern flipped a Fresh one, and she flipped because he took her too high. They took her too high. She broached. She came out of the water, and when she came back in, she did a slow roll, and that was the end of Fresh One as a foil research craft. So Vern didn't always practice what he preached, but neither did any of my other flying instructors.
He flipped her before I met her then, because he was always whispering in my ear that these little hints that he was giving me that, when we owned her and we started flying her, that there were certain things that you, like Richard, I'm sure everybody, you have that gut feeling when you're a CEO of a ship that just something doesn't sound right, something's winding down or something is not noisy that should be noisy. And that was always one of those that Vern cautioned me about, don't get too carried away when you're in sea state zero, because she's not as stable as perhaps we think. And the Boeing engineers behind the door had all their little calculations that said there was a point at which she might flip.
Well, I will tell you this, and those people who were at the hydrofoil conference several years ago know what I said. When we were first operating in 1965, 68, we were told that anything over 40 knots was confidential. And of course, we operated at 42 knots. Well, that was confidential. We used to put a piece of masking tape over the the pit log. In April of 1971, the Navy put out a public release that said the Tucumcari went over 50 knots. And so we took off the masking tape from the pit log and said we could do over 50 knots. And I will say this, that somewhere in excess of 60 to 65 knots is supercavitation. So we did not have the ability to do supercavitation, and without breaching confidentiality for the U.S. Navy, we did not exceed supercavitation. So you can go back to my disclosures from 2013, from the disclosures that I made to the U.S. Navy back to 2013 to disclose what I said then as to the speed of Tucumcari. But again, anyway, I do have some questions for Captain Weiskopf. I'm very curious from what I saw of the PHM configuration. The experience that I had on Tucumcari, I don't know if you noticed, we had a very weird, well, Tucumcari's picture is behind me, and I'm in the way actually, but we had a, as I understand it, Martin had a lot to do with it. Martin Mandels had a lot to do with it. We had a windscreen up on the that to stick our head out above the pilot house, because Boeing, as you experienced, had this, in Grumman also had the problem that they built this damn, excuse my English, they built this damn cockpit that you couldn't see outside of the cockpit. And I'm sure that, and it did the same thing with the PHM, you couldn't see around anything unless you had a rearview mirror where you got outside the craft to see what was going on. You couldn't see how you could refuel. You couldn't see how you could replenish or go alongside or come alongside to moor. How did you do that on the PHM? Did you have I know you had a hatch out behind you, but you only had position for 3 officers in the bridge. How did you do that?
Well, the only time I can recall that we were, and it was actually a very fun night because I went out back of the pilot house and we had not sound powerful, I think we had the ICX, whatever it was called. And I had night vision goggles on and we were running around playing Orange Force, shooting at all the Navy ships. And we were running dark and they were all, with NVGs, and we were basically, I was basically steering the ship, just, come right, come left, whatever. Very interesting to be able to con the ship alongside, or alongside for unrep, or even bring it alongside the pier, because it was a cockpit, and we just had to depend on sound-powered phone guys, things like that. But no, there was no different than, I guess, what you all had, which was, it was a cockpit with 3 seats, one for the helmsman, one for the OD, and then mine was the center seat. And then we had one lookout, one other guy up on the bridge. But, you're right. We actually got overflown. We were off of Honduras, and we got overflown by a jet that came up our stern, and just completely surprised us because we had no visibility what was going on astern.
Having been a pilot, that was immediately obvious. The first day I stepped aboard Tucumcari, Richard was saying we had 180-degree field of vision from the bridge. We couldn't see the port or starboard quarter. We couldn't see stern aft, and an airplane coming up from behind us, we would never see it coming. So that was a change. That was one of two changes that I was involved with. Richard made some when he came aboard, but I also was responsible for the strobe light and the siren, which is how I got the Coast Guard to allow me to fly into and out of San Diego Harbor at 40 knots, foil borne, from the Coronado Bridge out to the sea buoy. Richard, did they take that down when you went to Vietnam, or did they leave?
Oh, I just did what the hell I wanted to do. They didn't bother me at all.
Great.
I had a hell of a time. Nobody busted my chops. I had one lieutenant commander that tried to bust my chops because I had a mustache, and he never tried to do it again. And I'm still wearing a mustache.
Carl, you mentioned the difficulty coming alongside those kinds of issues. And Tucumcari had this incredibly, I don't remember the horsepower, Richard probably does, of our hull-borne engine, but it was a joke. It was a Cummins tractor diesel. And it was awful. And the last thing I did as my parting gift to Dick Stead was during the they did a yard period between commands, and they the thing that had to be done, they added a bow thruster, because when I would come into the pier at Coronado, I would draw a crowd. I mean, you can't believe how many people saw me smash Tucumcari into the pier at Coronado. And I've often wanted to see my fitness reports to see what they said about ship handling, but it was the wind and the lousy 60 horsepower diesel running through a very inefficient water jet, and where the reverser was nothing more than a bucket that if the solenoid worked would come down and reverse the water jet. Can you imagine the loss of efficiency in that powertrain?
Well, we had the same thing with the buckets. I'm not sure the configuration. I mean, at neutral, hopefully you were idling, but we actually lost a bucket down off of Honduras. That was a long 3 weeks. We actually lost a bucket, and fortunately, it fell off, but it stayed with the propulsor cable, so we had to retrieve it. But we ended up doing the rest of that transit with just one, with that bucket wide open. So that became interesting. Ship handling. Because I think it was the port when we lost the bucket, and so we had the starboard one we had control of, and the port one was always going ahead. So that made some interesting ship handling. But
when I hit the pier at Treasure Island, that did badly damage.
We don't want to talk about that, Martin. We don't want to talk about that.
Sorry, they took us over to Hunters Point and lifted us in. What was that huge German crane? They had two of them that we got after the war, and one of them went to Hunters Island. They literally picked up a Tucumcari in that and replaced the front strut. But when I hit the pier, the Navy had every television station in town filming the arrival of the Tucumcari at the pier, and my mother, who was at the time a morning television host in San Francisco and known by all these people, it was called the 1MC. Richard, is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I said, "God damn it," as I was 1 second away from hitting the pier before I knew that we'd lost the solenoid. And so among the people who were there were the commandant of the Naval District and I think it was an admiral in charge of the Treasure Island Naval Air Station, commander, and he called me to their office to talk to me about saying "God damn it" over the 1MC, which of course you could hear everywhere on the ship because we didn't have the earphones and the microphones. The guys out on the deck were listening to the deck speakers. And I told him what happened and what caused it. And the one admiral, after reflecting for a while, looked at me and said, I would have said the same thing. So I was never disciplined for hitting the pier, never disciplined for saying "God damn it" over the 1MC. But that night on television in San Francisco, every channel ran the collision of the Tucumcari here at Treasure Island and the captain of the ship saying "God damn it" as we crashed, and my mother crying. That was quite a day in my life.
As I recall, I think the famous command to the helm was, "God damn it, all back full." I could be wrong.
Oh, you might. I just kept saying no. I kept saying full, not back. I thought I was going back anyway.
Yes.
Anyway, I do have a question for Carl, if I may. You had in your crew, you had 4 officers. Obviously, the skipper was a lieutenant commander. Your XO, I assume, was a lieutenant. Did he have collateral duties in addition to being the XO?
Well, he had basically his major collateral duty was like he had some of the medicine part. He was post department head,
Okay.
and the two junior lieutenants were post divos. The Chang obviously had Chang, DCA, all those sort of things. That systems officer had CMS, secret control. He was navigate. Well, the navigator was actually a chief. My QMC was the navigator. So yeah, I mean, everything was divvied out. Obviously, it wasn't the same span of control with 14 or 15 guys as it was with 200 as far as the PR. Well, a lot of those programs, fortunately, we didn't have. I mean, now they got big soup list of all these different collateral duties. But
I came off of a minesweeper, so I understand collateral duties. But I marvel at the fact that you had 4 officers for 17 men. But while I was on deployment, I had 1 officer, and as I recall, I had 17 men on both of my deployments to Vietnam and Europe. Keeping track of 17 white hats was real difficult. And believe me, I paid the price in Europe. If you watched my if you watched my video, it was painful, believe me.
Yes, Martin Grimm.
Martin.
Yeah, so perhaps for Richard and Carl, what I'm always interested in is what you as operators perceive to be the advantages of hydrofoils in a naval sense. Obviously, they've got speed and good seakeeping, but from a military point of view, how do you see hydrofoils in future and where their niche is?
Well, I'll go first. I think from the standpoint, I mean, you read some of this stuff, and we do need to be careful as a Navy that we don't have so many whiz-bang, I'll use that term, surface ships that some of the smaller navies we work with seem that to be at a disadvantage. So I think, some of the stuff you're seeing come out about using the LCS is helpful, but there's still bigger ships. I mean, when we went to Honduras, like I said, we moored alongside a Honduran gunboat. And I think, they felt very comfortable Navy to Navy. We didn't have some big cruiser there. So I think, that standpoint, a smaller ship, I think, can go into ports and be a little less obtrusive than some big ones if you're doing that sort of mission. Even in the Mideast, where I did a couple of deployments on big ships, amphibs, it can get a little bit overwhelming when you see all these guys going ashore, particularly when you got the Marines aboard. So it's hard to say. The speed is in the right area. Like again, I'll go back to Key West. May not have been the best for the ship's longevity, but for the use of the ship, it was probably the best place to be at that time because of the speed, the able to get underway. And like I said, that one time we got underway in less than 2 hours. Gas turbine ships nowadays, it doesn't take 24 hours like it used to do for boilers, but even a gas turbine ship still going to take a while to get underway. And we were able to get underway. Well, when I had to get underway from that Honduran gunboat, because we were being blown down on her in the middle of the night, mean, we got underway like in 15 minutes. I mean, it was up and we were gone. And that was using the turbine because we had to get through the wind. But anyway, I don't know. It's a tough one. And, it's a tough nut to crack because small boats and hydrofoils and small boats give an advantage. But at the same time, the logistics leg, the crew endurance, there's some things there that come into play at the way our Navy operates.
And Richard?
Yes, sir.
Oh, it's the same question. Where do you see there's still a niche for hydrofoils in any Navy?
I have no problem with hydrofoils in the Navy. I really don't. I think that Mark had put out an interesting question the other day about the fear of hydrofoils. We had Tucumcari of all of the hydrofoils had 5 interesting damage sequences. And of the 5, the first was probably not intended. It was a God created one with a, and I wasn't there. It was a submerged loghead in Puget Sound. The second was with the hydraulics, loss of hydraulics when he pulled into San Francisco, coupled with a problem with judgment in ship handling. The third was a problem with, as I mentioned in my video, with the loss of the problem with the bow doors, which was a design problem, coupled by insistence that the craft could do more than it could. The fourth was a consequence of the third in off Brest-France, which was again, the craft hit the unusual wave that caused the bow doors again to fail, which again was a design problem, not something that was caused by the individual. But the fifth one was certainly, and I hesitate to fault ship handling, but it was a consequence of a bad quartermaster, his navigation skills, and a bad decision by the skipper by running aground. It's none of those. I'm sorry. One of those was a consequence of nature, and that's the deadhead that he hit in Puget Sound. The rest of those are all a combination of bad seamanship or bad judgment by the skipper. So I can't say that a hydrofoil is not something that should be feared as a transport, to be feared, as Mark kind of alluded to in his question. And I don't mean to say that Mark indicated that it should be feared. He really didn't. It was a question that he raised. Why shouldn't we have hydrofoils? And we should have hydrofoils. They are an asset to the future of sea handling. I don't see a problem
Richard, one thing that neither of us mentioned, because we weren't affected by it and it didn't affect Boeing, but there was another a PGM called the Flagstaff, which was built by Grumman. And for those of you who might not be aware of it, during one of her RDT&E runs off of the coast of San Diego, she hit a whale. And it was enough of an impact to cause, I think, a couple of injuries on board, but didn't do any mechanical damage or physical damage to the ship, but it did kill the whale. And the publicity from that incident tarnished every hydrofoil in the Navy that thereafter ran in San Diego, because it was the first thing the media would bring up whenever we were announcing something spectacular or Flagstaff had done. So the environment, I'll lump that as an environmental issue. And, you know, it could have been a swimmer coming up. It could have been a small boat. It could have been a water skier. It could have been anything. But when you're going that fast and that powerfully depending again on the weather and the time and everything, I never ran at night. Richard, you did a lot of night flying in Tucumcari. I think, I'm not sure. And we know that when she go aground in Puerto Rico, she went on to a coral reef, which I guess at the end of the day is another form or variation of going aground. The environmentalists don't like hydrofoils, so you generally are frightened by new technology. There's a lot of different objections that can be made to hydrofoils, but one of the ones that we must always consider, those of us who haven't experienced this, is the environmental concern.
I think that it is grossly unfair to say that the hydrofoils are adverse to the environment, especially when we use the Tucumcari running aground in off Puerto Rico as an example. Flagstaff having an impact with whales certainly would have an adverse effect on the environment with whales. That's certainly a good argument. But overall, with the hydrofoils, with as much time as we have had at sea with hydrofoils in a hydrofoil environment over the number of years that we have operated, it is just not tenable to use that as an argument against hydrofoils, to say that it is adverse to sea life.
You'd never guess that Richard and I went to law school after we got out of the Navy, would you?
Well, okay.
No, it's true, Richard. I agree with you completely. I don't think anything that's happened. There were 4 people hospitalized when Boeing was running a Tucumcari in Puget Sound and hit the deadhead. That made a lot of news. And
well,
didn't help.
Again, I was not there, and I can't attest to that. But again, I'm only talking about what I have experienced and what other experience that I have seen and heard.
And I agree with you, Richard. I agree completely with your point.
Okay.
Just to follow up on that, the deadhead issue, I think PHM-1 might have hit a deadhead at one point in Puget Sound, and Carl would know this. So for the production ships, the follow ships, there was an effort put into designing an energy absorbing system at the top of the king post for the forward strut. And there was and I can probably find the numbers that went into the specification for the PHM3 series, and it assumed a deadhead of about, I don't know, 1.5 feet, 2 foot in diameter, across the diameter of the deadhead, hitting the tip of the forward foil at a speed of, over 40 knots.
I think that, I remember something being discussed like that. And
yeah,
I think the interesting thing is, in all my time driving ships, is during the day, we go out of our way to get out of the way of something, whether it's a boat off of Vietnam or whatever, but at night we just fly around. I mean, but you're right. I don't think we ever tested it, thank goodness. But I do remember the Boeing engineers saying something along that line. But to go what Martin said earlier, several of the hydrofoils have hit whales down in the Caribbean. I don't know if they all got it, but talking to them, they've all seemed like every one of them hit. And there were some accidents where I think the CO one time was went through the window or something, but it was fairly significant when they hit a whale. So it's not just you all that did that on the other ships. They were doing that when they were operating down in the Caribbean.
Right. The only other environmental related issue I remember working the follow ships was, if the PHM found themselves in an area where they couldn't get, the shore power capabilities that they needed and had to run the SPU, there was some complaint, there was a community noise issue because with those Garrett, the APUs running.
Oh yeah, they were loud. There's no doubt about it.
And one of the noise paths was up, going up the stack of the APU, and so we did I don't know if anybody here knew William Bauman. He was the ship design manager on PHM. I worked with him for a number of years, and he had some acoustics guys, friends he knew out on the West Coast at Lockheed. In fact, it was in the same area as the Skunk Works, and these guys were super experts on acoustic silencers. And so we went to the noise group at Naval Ship Engineering Center at the time, saying we got to do something about. We think there's a way to put a different cap over the inlet for the SSPU and attenuate some noise. And they wanted like $30K to study it. William knew these guys out at Lockheed. They did a design. William and I went out there and met with them. They fabricated the thing. They installed it on PHM1, and it resulted in and we took noise measurements all around the top side, and it was something like 12 to 15 dB reduction in ambient noise as a result of this acoustic cap. And the bolt pattern was identical to what was there, just the original weather cap. So it was an example of the kind of thing that could be done, and that whole job was done for under $40,000 at that time. So it was, I was a young engineer. It was an interesting thing, and basically this guy Williams said, "Hey, if you guys in the engineering group here in headquarters don't want to go ahead and do some hardware, I'll figure out how to do it," and it worked. So it was an interesting drill. The other thing, we were trying to remember names at Boeing and management, and the names I remember were Ed Zarnicki was one, and Bob Bateman, who was mentioned, and then the people I worked with most were the working level guys. Dick Merritt. There was a guy named Jack Kelly. I think he was a machinery guy, and the weights people, the arrangements people, Mac Worthen. And we had, back at that time in the NAVSEC engineering organization, we had a really amazing cadre of in-house government engineers, naval architects, marine engineers. And when we worked at production ship spec, PHM3, there were thousands and thousands of hours on the Boeing and Navy, both sides. And meetings, I was going out there every month. We did the producibility studies after the opera valve issues were surfaced on Pegasus. The stress corrosion cracking, the foil-borne propulsor erosion, gearbox problems. And there was this amazing team put together with Navy Department engineers and Boeing engineers. And when we got together out there at meetings, it was like we were working, it was like we were working in one organization. We were just focused on addressing those opera valve deficiencies and getting, we had to get congressional approval and besides the Navy approval to award fellowship contract with Boeing Marine Systems. So, this was like, at that time, I was only 7 or 8 years into my career with the Navy Department. And I want to tell you, besides seeing the ship and going out, seeing the production ships being built in that hangar, working with the Boeing engineers and having lunch with them at the cafeteria. They had the greatest salad bar. You'd pay by the ounce for your salad. It was an amazing experience. And my big takeaway was at the working level, we weren't like industry against the government. We were all focused on figuring the damn thing out, going back to Congress with, hey, here we had to cite chapter and verse in the follow ship specs as to how each of those deficiencies on the lead ship were corrected, including foil cavitation on the foil systems, because the foil contours, due to fabrication at 17.4 pH on the first ship, there was all kinds of out of tolerance on those foils, and they cavitated like a son of a gun. So one of our engineers in the Hydro group put together a contract drawing on foil contour tolerances, and Boeing, and part of this was helped out by the fact there was stress corrosion cracking. We had to eliminate some of the thin foil skins and spars, and that the follow ship foils contours were fantastic. And there was, my recollection was up to design speed, there was essentially no cavitation on the follow ship foil system. So it was just an amazing effort to solve lead ship problems and deliver follow ships that were performed better, were more reliable, and all that. So and it was due to a team effort, Boeing and the in-house Navy people. And it was great to be a part of that, to see what a team like that could accomplish. And
Mark, it's amazing that we never met. Bob Bateman was the first general manager of Boeing Advanced Marine Systems. I worked for him there were 2 years between my junior and senior year at Stanford, and irrespective of my later returning to Boeing for the Tucumcari when I was a Navy officer, and when I worked at Boeing, I worked for Bob Bateman, and then I worked with Dick Merritt. You mentioned his name. He was the father of the automated control system for hydrofoils. I give him more credit than anyone else. He's the one who figured out, so that when we see a hydrofoil making a coordinated turn and we say, oh, that's just like an airplane. Well, it was Dick Merritt who did the translation and made it work. And it was also Dick Merritt who replaced me as co-pilot of the Fresh One 2 months before it flipped. I think he was aboard when it flipped, if I recall correctly, although it may have been a guy from the Bureau of Ships. I think it was Dick Merritt. Served him right.
Right. And then Martin, you remember, and then one of Dick's compadres was Dave Alling. You remember that name?
No, I don't, but I'll never forget Dick Merritt. I wanted to be Dick Merritt.
Yeah, Dick was so smart. He was a great guy to work with. Yeah. Anyway, enough. That's just storytelling, but it's important to bring out. It showed what we were doing back in the 70s, and
you're right. I also thought it was great to be able to be on today with Richard Stead, because my experience was so different than his. He was in combat. With Tucumcari, I was in combat before I came back to be the first officer in charge of Tucumcari. And he was in combat with Tucumcari, which is really important because that's life and death. And then he also did the sales job for Boeing with NATO, and the resistance and the troubles he had were unforgivable. And I think that unfortunately I can never figure out what's wrong with hydrofoils. I think they're terrific, and everything we know, even everything has its pluses and its minuses. But when you add it all up, the hydrofoils are a huge plus, and nothing like them for coastal, all-weather patrol. Where are you going to get anything to equal a hydrofoil? And that's not to dismiss other and higher uses of the hydrofoil.
Yeah, I think the Germans and the Italians both hung in for a while, and I think that it looked like that Germany would go ahead with it. In fact, you may know this, Martin, but it was the German requirements that really drove the size of what wound up being PHM. They had a Citadel, system requirement for NBC protection, or CBR, whatever you called it. And, and they had heavier missiles and all that. So that drove the size.
When Carl mentioned metric, I was trying to remember where that came from, because that was crazy. I mean, Boeing didn't build anything with metric, despite the fact that they built almost all the world's airplanes at the time. But that was part of that NATO business that never materialized.
Any other comments at this point?
I have a couple of things.
All right.
One is the whole metric aspect of the Aries is still a pain in the rear, especially here in the Midwest. I've been an engineer for almost 40 years now, and I worked with a lot of aerospace companies, and they're still English. You go to Lockheed Grumman, and I call it English, which always pisses off the Canadians. I apologize. It's an imperial measurement as opposed to metric, but so it is what it is. So the decimal inch pretty much killed the metric system in the United States. Once we went to the decimal inch, it was the need for it. When we were dealing with 77, 80 seconds, okay, that was a little clumsy. But anyway, I did want to say something to Martin Mandels, a couple of things. One is when you talked about hitting that bridge. And so when we were testing out the ship, because we hadn't taken her out for a while when she was in Brunswick, and we were moving to our new home in Gasconade, which was 100 miles to the south. And so we take her out on the Grand River, and we have a problem with the starboard transmission. It won't lock up. So we're running solely on the port engine, and it has a bucket. Same thing as a bucket with a hydraulic actuator with an electro-hydraulic valve on it, and so we're going to turn around. And so I'm on the ship. I'm at the helm, and BJ is down on the bow, and Bob's back on the stern. And I go to turn, and then I'm getting close to the bank, so I pull her into reverse. And what happens is the bucket doesn't go down, and so BJ turns around, yells at me, because here we're about to hit the bank of the Grand River, and I just gave her all the throttle I had, which of course happened the exact same thing. Drove her right up onto the bank of the Grand River. Fortunately, and he of course is looking at me like I'm a complete idiot. And fortunately, it was just mud, and all we did was get mud splattered on the front of the ship. So I know exactly. I can't imagine doing it in front of every news service in San Diego, let alone causing a significant amount of damage. That must have been, I was glad that I had 3 guys on the ship with me when I did that. So I feel for you.
Did you say, God damn it?
Yeah, you got to say the words.
Yeah.
Oh, I said, God damn it. Matter of fact, BJ said, God damn it. Bob said, God damn it.
By the way, and with Richard on the phone here, just quickly, and this is another issue, and it's a problem, I suppose, with any new ship development. But my most embarrassing moment on Tucumcari, apart from having everybody come down to the pier to watch me try to bring the ship alongside, was it was either Newport Bay, Newport, Oregon, or I'll think of it in a moment. We came in. We'd flown down from wherever we came from. And the idea was that we were going to go in at the sea buoy, and we were going to tie up, and they were going to have a big public event to welcome us to, I think it was Morro Bay. And I bring the Tucumcari in. We lower the foils. We stop. We lower the foils. We've got our hull-borne propulsion system going, and I've got the rudder. I've got the bucket going the right way. I got everything the way it's supposed to, and we're headed for the reeds. We're headed for the we're headed for the side of the bay. And nothing I can do. So I did what I thought was the most efficient thing. I aimed the bow into the wind, right, which happened to be straight for the pier. Beautiful plan, except the wind was blowing at 21 knots. And on a good day, I could get 6 knots out of that hull-borne propulsion unit, Dick. And we kept going closer and closer to being aground. I was going to put the foils down and decided they would be upset with me if I damaged the foils again. So I called the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard towed us to the pier it was Morro Bay. The Coast Guard towed us to the pier at Morro Bay. My most embarrassing moment as the captain of Tucumcari, really embarrassing.
So Martin, on the Fresh One, I have to ask, we have both sets of foils, and the first set came. They were acquired with the Fresh One, and they're pretty generic. You know, they're kind of clunky, fabricated, and they're nice. But the transition foils are pristine. I mean, they're look like they go fast. Were they ever installed on the Fresh One? Were they used? They look like they're just brand new, right out of the crate.
Not when I was there. Now, remember, I moved from the hydrodynamic test system, that hydroplane that Boeing had, with George Adams. George Adams came before Vern Salisbury, and George Adams was the main guy on the HTS. It was called the Aquajet, the J-33 engine sitting up on, great experiment, great love of my life. That was really neat. And I was transferred from that project over to Fresh One. I'm thinking right around the first of the year in 1964. I hope I got that right. And so the only foils I ever saw or flew on the Fresh One were the original foils. By the way, the one thing interesting that I was going to comment, which I will do now, you may know that Fresh One hull-borne was propelled by 2 outboard motors that were on the stern of the catamaran hulls. And that worked a lot better than the buckets or the diesels that we had on Tucumcari. I can assure you of that. They were great. Never had a problem.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Well, I did.
100 horsepower Mercury outboards. 100. Yeah, I think that's right.
Wow. Well, I didn't think they would work at all, hardly, but I'm glad to hear that they did.
They were great. That's how we would get in and out of up and down the Duwamish River to get back to the Missile Production Center in Seattle, which was the Boeing facility that was the home to Fresh One during all the RDT&E work.
Okay, any other discussion before we wrap up? Okay, I want to thank everybody, Richard and Carl and Eliot, for a really interesting presentation and discussion. I want to remind everybody that the next session for this virtual conference is going to be on 17th of November next week. That's Tuesday, starting at 7 p.m. U.S. East Coast time. And we'll have 3 topics. I'll be giving 2 presentations, one on U.S. Navy hydrofoil development. This is everything prior to PHM, and then a separate briefing on PHM, a retrospective. And then after those 2, Mark Rice from MAPC will give a presentation on the HISWAT, the hydrofoil small water plane area ship. This was a 12-ton demonstration vessel that was built largely through the efforts of John Meyer, he's passed away now, but he was president of IHS for many years. And it's an excellent presentation. I recommend everybody tune in for that. And we'll be posting this recording of this session before too long on the conference website. Ray, did you have anything else you wanted to say? I think you're muted, Ray.
I say thank you very much, gentlemen. I learned a lot. It was very entertaining, and long live the hydrofoils. I hope they come back to the military. That would be a good thing.
Thank you much. I appreciate the opportunity to interface with you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.
Good night, y'all.
Good night. Thanks.
Okay.